Hey everybody, this is Dr. Jacobs. Welcome to lecture on ethics and behavioral research. There are a few things that I want you to be able to do by the end of this unit. I want you to be able to explain the historical underpinnings of the current ethical principles of psychologists and code of conduct, aka the APA ethics code. This could include things like the Belmont report. It could be talking about why we need code of ethics that are based in World War II in the Nazi regime. It could be talking about some of the unethical studies that the unit talks about, whether it's the Milgram experiments or the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I want you to be able to distinguish among the 5 principles of the American Psychological Association's ethics code. I want you to be able to apply the information from the APA ethics code to creating and carrying out research. I want you to be able to find and complete the relevant IRB forms for a research study. So for example, informed consent, recruitment materials, appropriate IRB application, and choosing which IRB application that you need based on the study that you're going to create. And we're actually going to be doing these things. So it'll be really important that you're paying attention to the lecture, that you're taking notes, that you're asking me questions if you have them, and that we're really making sure that we're learning this information. I want you to be able to analyze the benefits and risks of a research study. I want you to be able to successfully complete the RCR for social and behavioral sciences training. This is not just important for you, but this is really important for our program as well, as it helps us to have one piece of evidence to show that we're training you to be ethical researchers. I want you also to be able to define and apply chapter terminology appropriately. All right, so let's get started. Some of these historical underpinnings. We spent some time learning about the Milgram experiment. There are some materials in our folder for this week that has real footage from the Milgram experiment. To me, it's just really amazing to see some of this footage. Hopefully you watched it before you're watching this lecture, but it always kind of gets me when the respondents are really concerned about the Confederates, but then they keep going on and administering those shocks. You also will want to be really familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Belmont report, and your reading goes over this in detail. Also, the RCR training that you have to complete for this class, and even to be able to do the project, goes into a lot more details than what this will do. So the Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct was created by the American Psychological Association, which is also known as APA. Sometimes you hear this document referred to as the APA Ethics Code, and it covers more than just research. It covers all areas of practice for people who identify as psychologists. Within this document, there are 5 general principles that you learn about. There's also Section 2 competence, Section 8 research and publication. There's also Section 4 that we'll talk about a little bit. And these are areas that kind of really are important as we think about conducting ethical research. There are other areas that apply to practice and things like that as well, but in this class, we're primarily interested in learning about the ethical codes. So let's start out with the general principles. And according to APA, the general principles, as opposed to the ethical standards, are aspirational in nature. So what this means that these are kind of our ideals. These are what we shoot for. And they are what we want to try to do. So there are 5 different principles, general principles of the APA code. There's beneficence and non-maleficence. There's fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. And we're going to go through each of these. We're also going to go through some of the other sections in the ethics code. That's not just a summary necessarily. I have the link to the ethics code in our materials so that you can read the things word for word and not just some summaries of some of the things that we're going to learn about. All right, so principle A, beneficence is the moral obligation to do what's right. And so when we're conducting research or we're in practice or anything like that, we have more obligation to do what's right. And while also have the obligation to do no or least amount of harm to reach the valuable outcome. So it means that we don't just harm people, that the means don't justify the ends, that we have the obligation to do what is correct, what is right, and also to do little to no harm. So according to the APA Ethics Code, they say that psychologists are alert to and guard against personal, financial, social, in organizational or political factors that might lead to misuse of their influence. And so, as psychologists, as researchers, there is some sort of authority, which we kind of talked about earlier in this semester, that we have where people look at us and think, okay, they know what they're talking about. I should listen to them. And we have to be really aware of that because we don't want to do something that's going to hurt somebody or get someone to do something that's not right. We also have the principle of fidelity and responsibility. And it's so funny because I always like this quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And there's a lot of questions as to who actually said this. Some people say Spider-Man, it came from Uncle Ben. Some people say Voltaire, although some research on that is showing that that's inconclusive. Some attribute this to Winston Churchill, who had something similar in one of his addresses. But really, let's just quote Spider-Man for now, right? So with great power comes great responsibility. And so with research or any types of things that we're doing as psychologists, fidelity means faithfulness, okay? This is summed down into make sure that we don't abuse the trust that people put into us as researchers, okay? So how, working in the field of psychological science, are we to be faithful in the research that we do? What are some ways? And these are some things that you can think about. I wish kind of this was a face-to-face lecture so that we could have this discussion, because there's some really good discussions that could come out of the content for today. Okay. Psychologists strive to contribute a portion of their professional time for little or no compensation or personal advantage. And so some of the skills that we learn within psychological science deal with our ability to think critically, for us to develop research questions and hypotheses and then collect the data to get the answers to these things. And some of these skills that we have come from our advantages of being able to access education, which a lot of the world doesn't get to do. And so it's our responsibility to try to be able to give back in some way. So this could be if you are a licensed therapist or a psychologist doing some pro bono work. This could be as a researcher conducting research that's not charging people money, that you're doing it for free. For me, one way that I do this is hosting my voluntary research lab, where I train people to become suicide prevention researchers. So principle C then is integrity. Psychologists seek to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in the science, teaching, and practice of psychology. So with research, this means that we're doing what we need to conduct good research. This is making sure that we are trained, that we know what we're doing, that if we don't know what we're doing, we find ways to learn that, whether that's getting a mentor, whether that's reading books, whether that's taking additional classes, and that we don't ever make anything up. We are looking for the truth, and the truth sometimes will not align with our ideas, and that's okay. And that's why science is beautiful. We also have principle D of justice. Psychologists exercise reasonable judgment and take precautions to ensure that their potential biases, the boundaries of their competence, and limitation of their expertise do not lead to or condone unjust practices. And so for this, a lot of times, students will come into this class, and we'll talk about this later in this presentation as well, but I'll say, hey, let's come up with a topic, just like a general area that you want to read research in, so that you could create some sort of research study later on. And I'll give some examples. For example, in my area of research right now, I like to study the suicide warning signs to see if they work or not. And so suicide warning signs more would be kind of the specific research topic, whereas some students will be like, I want to see what causes depression. And there's several things that are going to be wrong with that. One, in order to do causal research, and this is something our book doesn't do a very good job of, you have to do experimental design. So we ethically cannot design a study where we cause people to get depression and cause other people not to get depression and see what leads to that. We can't do that. And so we'll talk about that more when we get to experimental design. Or if you had stats with me, we talked about that quite a bit. And so we also, I would say it's unethical that we try to design a study in which we haven't done any reading in. And that's why we haven't really designed our studies quite yet. One, we're still learning about variables and things like that. We're learning about ethics. We'll learn about measures and different types of study designs before I let y'all loose so you can start practicing the skills that we're learning in here. But I would say it's almost unethical for anybody to try to design a study when they haven't read the research in the particular area because it's outside of your competence. And we got into that in our last lecture where we were talking about how each research area has its own culture, has its own words, it has its own history where we found things that have worked and have not worked. And we just have to make sure that we're really kind of paying attention to our area of competence, that we're not working outside of what we know to do. And if we want to learn something new, that we're taking the proper steps to do this, and that we're not always worried about being right, because we're not worried about being right. We're worried about finding the truth. We also have principle E, which is respect for person's rights and dignity. And so psychologists are aware of the respect in cultural, individual, and role differences, including those based on age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, language, and socioeconomic status, and consider these factors when working with members of such groups. And so for me, what this begs the question is like, how do we know that we are culturally competent to be able to work within different groups? Are we being mindful of the things that we're doing within research? So for example, in some cultures, writing someone's name in red ink indicates that they have passed away or they have died. And so if you're working with a particular culture, that is something that you're going to want to be very sensitive of, so that you don't elicit you don't harm some of these groups, so you don't have biases within your own research as well. So section 2 talks about competence. This is the actual code right here. It's linked in our material so you can read it, but we're going to go through some of these individually. So 2.01, boundaries of competence. Psychologists provide services, teach, and conduct research with populations and in areas only within the boundaries of the competence based on their education, training, supervised experience, consultation, study, or professional experience. And so for this kind of extends where it's saying like, we don't do research where we haven't read about it yet and seen what studies have been done. And that's something that eventually we'll do. We'll be reading journal articles in the particular areas that we want to study. We'll read the whole thing. If we may struggle a little bit. If you struggle, come into my office hours, schedule a Google Meet. We can talk through some of the problems that you're having. But when we're doing things, we do them right and we don't just make things up. We make sure that we're doing things in an educated way. 2.03, maintaining competence. Psychologists undertake ongoing efforts to develop and maintain their competence. So right now, y'all are maintaining and developing competence by being in this class. We're learning to be researchers. We're learning to be critical thinkers. We're learning how to use data to answer questions, which are all really beautiful things. Once you don't have me anymore, what's your plan though for continuing to do this? Once you're out of school, like how will you use these skills? How will you keep maintaining these skills so you don't lose them? And so as a professor, one way I do this is I attend national conferences. And that's something that I really like to take my research lab to, because I'm able to model to them, what's it look like to learn from these other professionals? What's it like to be a part of a professional organization that has a scholarly journal that you can read new articles about? What's it like to make sure that you're taking the time to read what's coming out in the research right now? And so these are things that we do. 2.05, notice we're not going through all the sections, we're just going through some of the relevant ones. This is delegation of work to others. So if you delegate responsibilities, even within research, you have to make sure that whoever you're delegating to doesn't have a dual relationship that conflicts with what you're asking them to do. You also can only delegate to people who have education, training, and experience in the tasks that you're asking them to perform. You also have to ensure that people you delegate tasks to perform the tasks competently. 2.06, personal problems and conflicts. If we were in an in-person class, I would ask you, how can personal problems interfere with your work? How have they interfered with your work before? So what can you do to minimize these problems? So now that you've thought about that a little bit, like when you've had problems in the past, what have you done to be able to minimize that? So if you cannot minimize personal problems that would interfere with your research or your practice, what should you do? Okay, so those are some things to think about. It's really important to try to minimize these things so you don't harm people, so that you can do your best work as either a researcher or a teacher, as a psychologist, or whatever you go out and do. This is just good sage life advice as well. So if you're having a personal problem, how can you minimize it so it doesn't impact your work? So section 4, privacy and confidentiality. 4.01, maintaining confidentiality. Psychologists have a primary obligation and take reasonable precautions to protect confidential information obtained through or stored in any medium, recognizing that the extent and limits of confidentiality may be regulated by law or established by institutional rules or professional or scientific relationship. So it's really important that you're really protecting your data. One way that you can do it is with some software, you can add passcodes to it. It used to be when filling out IRB forms, when we had things that we would have paper data, we'd be like, we had behind a locked suite door and a locked office door and a locked file cabinet that this person, this person, this person have access to. Now that we have a lot of our information that's online, how do you protect it so that if someone does hack your Google Drive, they can't get into it easily, right? Like, how do you encrypt files so that you can put a password that only the people who need to have it have that passcode? And a lot of times, like when you're filling out paperwork for this, you have to explain how you're going to protect the confidentiality of your participants. Also discussing the limits of confidentiality. This is beyond research too, right? This would be in a therapeutic relationship. This could be in a teaching relationship. And this is something I talk to my students about typically on the first day in-person class. If I have you in person, I would say that something like, hey, I have training in therapy, but I am not a therapist. I cannot be your therapist. But I can help get you in the right direction. But if you tell me you're going to harm yourself or you're going to hurt someone else or you're abusing someone, then I'm going to have to let someone know. And if you tell me anything about being sexually assaulted or sexual harassment, I am a mandated reporter and I have to report that to the Title IX coordinator. I have to fill out a report. I'll be there to walk you through the situation as much as I am allowed and you need me to, but I will have to report it. And so that is discussing my limits of confidentiality. Within the therapeutic relationship, a lot of times people will say, hey, if you tell me you're suicidal, if you're homicidal or you're abusing someone, then I have to let someone know. And actually, in some states, that's not the same. So, and it's really interesting that we have these things. The thing that is the same is that just being really upfront in any relationship about if there's something they tell you that if you're going to have to tell someone or not. So again, relevant limits of confidentiality often include if a person reports they're going to kill themselves, kill someone else, or they're abusing a minor. 4.04, minimizing intrusions on privacy. Psychologists discuss confidential information obtained in their work only for appropriate scientific or professional purposes and only with persons clearly concerned with such matters. So we don't go around spreading information, whether that's therapeutic information or if that's information gained within research, whether that's information that we gain from reviewing articles if we're reviewing them for a peer-reviewed journal article. 4.07, use of confidential information for didactic or other purposes. So didactic is teaching, like I am doing with you all right now. So if you use information writings, lectures, etc., there's some guidelines that you have to follow. You have to you have to disguise identifying information. You have to or get permission in writing or have legal authorization to share that information. So if you go on to graduate school in psychology, sometimes you'll have to share case reports or something like that. And you have to de-identify the information, whether it's blacking things out with a marker or changing names and things like that. And professors and faculty members will do the same thing so that we're protecting people. And the same things with research, especially if you tend to lean qualitative research. And here we're going to be doing quantitative, where typically we'll have participant ID numbers. And we typically will try not to identify participants just because it makes it easier to get through the IRB process for a training project like this class would do. With this, though, with qualitative, sometimes it's harder because there's a lot of words, people use names and things like that. And I've done some qualitative where we've just had to make up fake names and ensure that we didn't have the real names anywhere in the manuscript that we submitted. Section 8, research and publication. This one has a whole bunch of different little areas. We're going to go through a few of these. In here, we're not going to go through every single one of these, but these are the different sections of Section 8. So Section 801, institutional approval. You have to have institutional approval to be able to conduct research studies. For this class, we're doing training projects where we're going to be collecting data and analyzing it. But we will still go through either the IRB process or a mimic IRB process for this class. So UCM's Institutional Review Board IRB is called the Human Subjects Committee. And this is a link to be able to access the IRB. It's really interesting because it's a committee that has people from not just psychological science, but you'll have like a hard science person, usually like a biologist. You'll have a community member that's not typically a scientist, and you have all these. You'll have a student member of the IRB, and they go through and review these applications. Very rarely will you submit an IRB application that won't come back with some edits, especially in my area, suicide prevention. There's a lot of safeguards that I have to put in place or explanations that I have to make because people really misunderstand that kind of research. Along with IRB, which is for human subjects, there is IACUC, and that's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And this is for research that is on animals, and we have that here as well. And that's going to be the relevant link for that. So when you go to the web page, this is what it's going to look like. It'll say human subjects. It'll say institutional review board, and there'll be a whole bunch of different things that they have here. You'll notice that the IRB is housed through the Office of Sponsored Programs and Research Integrity, and their contact information can be found on the web page. But in order to do anything for this class or anything for a research study, you first have to go through the city RCR for social and behavioral sciences. So in order to pass this class, you have to complete this successfully, and you need to upload it to our portal for it in our course webpage. So again, we'll be collecting data in this course, and you will not be able to do that without this training, and also later completing the proper IRB application for the study that we're going to design. So IRB approval, you have to have IRB approval before collecting data. If it's not something that you're going to be collecting data for, but you want to present at a conference and you want to do a lit review, technically you're supposed to fill out a form called the determination of research. And so if you're wanting to use a project in here for Great Plains, and if you want to use like a literature review, something like that, then you should fill out a determination of research. If you're wanting to use your project and present at Great Plains from this class with the data that we're using, we'll want to take it through the full IRB approval. That's a really cool experience. There's a program called the McNair Scholars here at UCM, and this is like research internship competitive program for people from different types of backgrounds. I'll put the video in our materials at some point, the recruitment video for McNair, so that y'all can look at that if you're interested in becoming a McNair Scholar. If you want to change any part of your study after completing the initial IRB form and getting approval, then you'll have to submit something called an amendment. You cannot make any changes to your study until that amendment is approved. Okay. And then when you're done with your study, you're gonna have to fill out something called a protocol closeout form. And that just tells them that you're done collecting data. If you have not completed data within a certain period of time, the IRB will send you a thing seeing if you want to extend your study as well. So helpful links at UCM. This is our webpage for Human Subjects Committee. Hopefully you'll be able to click these links from the Google Slides. We also have the UCM IRB forms that you'll want to look at. There is a template for how to create an informed consent. There's a difference between an informed consent if you're collecting data in person versus if you're doing an online study. And then your IRB applications are in there too. So here's some of the templates and things that we have. We have informed consent template. You'll have to adapt that to your needs. If you're doing an online one, you do use the second one. If you're doing a study with people who are under 18, which I suggest you don't do, you have to have assent from those participants, but you also have to have consent of the parent guardian as well. So if you have a waiver, you want to modify informed consent for research participants, there's a form for that. there's a whole bunch of just different forms. So if you want to conduct research at a different place, you'll have to go through the IRB here and the other place as well. If you have something weird happen, like something adverse where it hurts your participants or the animals that you're doing research, you have to report that. If there's research misconduct, there's a form for that. There's a form for the workflow for research. And then in the same forms area, there's application forms. So use the IRB submission form, and then you'll find the correct form for the study that you're doing. For this class, we want to do exempt studies. Okay. So you'll want to make sure that with the IRB training that you're doing this week, that you're paying attention to the differences between the exempt and the expedited / full. We don't want to be causing any harm to people. We want to maximize benefits. And we're not to the point where we're designing our studies yet. These are things to keep in mind as we start moving toward that part. 8.02 informed consent research. Participants have the right to understand the purpose of research, that they have the rights to withdraw from the study at any time without any penalty. Foreseeable consequences if they do withdraw from the study. Potential risks, discomfort, or adverse effects that may influence their decision to participate in the study. Possible benefits to participating in the study. The limits to confidentiality should be there in your informed consent form. Any incentives that they might get. So this could be money, this could be extra credit. We'll talk about incentives a little bit later in the lecture as well. And then who to contact with questions or concerns with the study. Also, there's a different informed consent for recording voices, images, and research. And so the research consists solely of naturalistic observations in public places and is not anticipated that the recording will be used in a manner that could cause personal identification or harm. So making sure that if that's something you're doing, that the participants can't be identified, or the research design includes deception, and consent for the use of the recordings obtained during debriefing. So we'll talk a little bit about debriefing as well. 8.04 client, patient, student, and subordinate research participants. This protects participants from adverse consequences of withdrawing from a study. So here at UCM, we use SONA to solicit student participation in the studies that we're conducting. And that is often for an assignment or extra credit in classes. If it's for extra credit or course credit, you have to have alternative activities for the class. So a lot of times general psych students will get credit for completing these SONA studies. And you can either do that, or they can do some sort of article review or go to some sort of presentation for these credits as well. So there has to be alternatives. They can't be forced into doing it. Dispensing with informed consent for research. This means some circumstances allow you to not have informed consent. Note, this is not the standard, and you still need to take it through IRB. We won't be doing any of that in here. Okay, offering inducements for research participation. In other words, incentives that I told you all that we talk about. Something that you really need to keep in mind with inducements or incentives, that they cannot be so large that it becomes coercive. So if I said, hey, students, you'll get an A in my class if you participate in the study, a lot of people are going to say, I'm going to do the study whether or not I want to, no matter what the impact is of the study or the drawbacks, and you can't do that. It's considered unethical. Deception in research. We learned about the Milgram experiment that had deception. So something that I want you to think about is, how do you justify deception in research? So if there's not another way to get the information and it limits harm to participants, then it's probably okay. Deception can be really interesting. Sometimes people do studies on like clothing and appearance of people, and they found, like in one study, I saw a student project, I think it was from William Jewell College, where they had a participant dress really nice and pretend fall, or it was Confederate, right? So it wasn't a participant. So Confederate is somebody who is in on the study, but it looks like they're not in on the study. And they had the door open and they had the participant in the room with the researcher, and they went to see, like, would people be significantly more likely to help somebody if they fell and they were dressed nice in heels, or if they were in sweats? And they found that if people looked nicer, that people were more likely to help, which I thought was a really interesting study. So you must allow participants to withdraw their data from your study if you use deception. So that means that Not only can they withdraw at any time, they can withdraw their data from your study as well. And then if you do use deception in your study, you have to debrief participants at the end and tell them that you used it and for what purpose. Which brings us to 8.08, debriefing. This is kind of like a little thing at the end. If it's online research, it could be like a little summary at the end that participants see. This provides opportunity for participants to know more about the results and the purpose of the study. Sometimes you don't want that information to go out right away, and it might say, hey, this is a study. The results will be posted here at this time. And if you say that you're going to do that, then you need to make sure that you follow through with that. So you reduce harm if you must wait to disclose the results. If you find out someone has been harmed as a result of your study, you must take reasonable steps to minimize harm. Okay. 8.10, reporting research results. Never make up your data. We don't do anything to our data without mentioning it in our studies. So if you took statistics with me, one thing we talked about was sometimes we have outliers in our data set, and all the parametric analyses that we learned. So our one sample z-test, independent samples t-test, dependent samples t-test, one way between groups ANOVA, the Pearson product moment correlation, linear regression, like all of them have an assumption or a criteria or an expectation that your data set that you have doesn't have any outliers or extreme scores in them. And so in my stats class, we learned to calculate z-scores, which are a type of standard score, to determine which participants' data might be an outlier. And so when we do that, if we remove an outlier in our data set, we keep track of how many participants' data that we removed and why. So the way that I taught my class to identify outliers was if you have a z-score of beyond plus or minus 3.29, then that's an outlier and we need to remove it if we're going to do a parametric analysis. Now, if we're going to do one of the non-parametric equivalents, which most of you have not learned yet because most of y'all probably have only had one introductory stats class or two introductory stats classes, then we just need to report that we remove these outliers and why. So also, if you see that you messed up somewhere, or you found out that you messed up, then you need to try your best to correct those mistakes. 8.11, plagiarism. Psychologists do not present portions of another's work or data as their own, even if the other work or data source is cited occasionally. And there's a lot of things that go into academic honesty that I think a lot of students don't know. So plagiarism is one. Another one is making sure that when we are getting publication credit, when we're doing peer-reviewed journal articles, that you only get authorship for studies that you significantly contributed to. And this is something actually I've seen in the real world where someone's like, oh, here's this data set. And after I did it, when I was getting ready to go publish, they're like, oh, we also want to be an author for this study. And that's actually unethical because they didn't contribute to the study. It was a secondary data set that I analyzed. And so I had to say, hey, this is actually an ethical problem. And then I never heard back from them. So also the order of authorship of a paper says something. So first author within psychological science means they're the person who did the most amount of work. And second, all the way to the end. It's not the same in every field. So like in the medical field, a lot of times the person who supervises is the very last author on medical journal articles. So it's really important in the beginning that you talk about order of authorship if you're working with a group in the beginning. And you outline what roles each person's going to do. Now, if people don't follow through on what they were supposed to do during the project, then you need to renegotiate the order of authorship. Okay. If you are doing an article and you go on to grad school and do a thesis or dissertation and it turns into a publication, you should be the primary author, not your thesis or dissertation chair. And that's something that is within the ethics code. 8.13, duplicate publication of data. So you do not present your data as new if you published it before. And if you have published it before, that's something you need to acknowledge in your paper, because what we see is that people will go out, and we learned about the studies where we do meta-analysis, where researchers will go and collect data and they'll try to analyze what's going on overall. Well, when scientists go and do that meta-analysis, they need to make sure that they're only using each data set once. And if someone is publishing the same data multiple times, then that really skews those results. Sharing research data for verification. So if you request data to verify someone's research, you can only use it for that purpose. You can't use it for to go and do new studies or anything like that. And if you want data for another reason or to analyze it for something else, then you need to fill out a data agreement form with the researcher who owns that data. Researchers are not obligated to share their data with you or for your own studies. So it's just if you found a result, you can request somebody's data and you have to keep your data for a certain amount of time. And that way they can run the analyses to make sure you found what you found. 8:15 reviewers. So we started learning about peer-reviewed journal articles. If you serve as an expert peer reviewer, you cannot steal other people's ideas and use them in your research. That's a no-no. Okay, so that's what we have for this week. This is a lot of information, and I provided a lot more information than what our reading did, especially with specifics from the APA ethics code. And so make sure that you're going through this information and all the readings that we're doing for this class, because we're going to be applying all of this. And so I really want you to think about some of these things that we learned. And when we go to design our own studies, I want you to make sure that you're applying some of these things so that I can see that you're learning. All right. Thank you all for a great week, and I'll see you soon.